Hi folks, and welcome to our third video on share-based compensation plans. In this video we're going to be looking not at equity settled plans but at cash-based plans, an example of which is a stock appreciation rights plan with forfeitures, assuming that people will leave throughout the vesting period. Now, different from our equity settled plans, people are going to receive cash at the end of the vesting period, or at whatever date after the vesting period the company decides they're going to make the cash payment. Now, the cash payment will be determined based on the positive difference between the fair value of the shares at the grant date and the fair value of the shares at the cash payment date. The fair value of the common shares at the grant date, that being the fair value at the date that the company agrees to issue these rights, is also known as the reference price, and the fair value of the shares at the cash payment date is at any point in time at the vesting date or beyond. That's determined by the company. So now, again, there are no shares granted with appreciation rights, only cash is granted, and the fair value of the share appreciation rights are calculated annually, so they'll have to be updated, unlike the equity settled plan where they were determined only at the grant date and didn't change. So now, let's begin by looking at an example to see how we estimate compensation expense. In this particular example, we have 40 employees that are awarded 10,000 units. We don't know what a unit is. They don't refer to them as shares because, again, it's got nothing to do with shares. But what we do know is that they can't refer to them as shares or options because no shares are going to be granted at the end. It's only cash paid. So now all we know is that 40 employees are collectively going to be offered 10,000 units. So that means that each employee is going to be given 250 units in this SAR program that will entitle them to cash payments. Again, the cash payments are going to be the difference between the reference price and the fair value of the shares at the end of 2013. So in our case, the companies decided that they would pay their employees a cash payment based on the fair value of those shares at vesting date, or the end of the vesting period. And again, the vesting period is 3 years. We know that the the fair market value of the shares at that date is $19 a share. So now we know that employees will be paid $90,000, right? That's going to be the cash payment at the end of 2013 to those employees based on the market value at the end of the vesting period and the reference price multiplied by the number of units. So now, if we look at the option fair value per unit, you'll notice it's changing every year, and the total fair value is going to be equal to the per unit times the total fair value. Notice here that we've got in 2013, these two amounts here are not applicable. The reason being that we're at the end of the period and we already know the value of the cash payment, so the value of the option or the rights fair value doesn't really matter. We already know how much we're paying people out. We're at the end of the vesting period. Now, how are we going to allocate the cash payment over the vesting period? Well, we're going to do it based on retention rates. And because we know that 25 of our 40 employees we estimate will stay, or that's our best estimate, we're going to use 62.5% as our estimate of employees that we expect to retain over the 3-year vesting period based on our first year experience, or our estimate in the first year. Now, as at the end of the second period, we estimate that over that entire vesting period, we think 30 employees will stay and 10 will go. And then, of course, by the time we get to the end of 2013, we don't have to worry about that because whoever's here is here and whoever's left has left. And we know that in total, over the 3-year period, we lost 7 people. So we know, in fact, 33 people have stayed because 7 have left. So now, let's use, similar to what we did in the equity-based plan, let's use the retention rates as well as the cumulative vesting fractions to allocate our compensation expense. So now, we know that the fair value of the options are $87,000, at the end of 2011, 30,000 at the end of 2012, and we already calculated based on the difference between the fair market value at the grant date, which is the reference price, and the fair market value at the vesting date. We know that the fair value of the units are 90,000. We're going to multiply each of the fair values in each year by the cumulative vesting factor in order to weight it, and then multiply each of these two the product of these two numbers by our estimated retention rate, which in 2011 was based on 25 of 40 people remaining, which is 62.5%. In 2012, it will be 75% because we estimate 30 of the 40 will stay throughout the vesting period. And again, we know now by the time we get to the end of 2013, we know exactly how many people have stayed. We know that 33 of 40, or 82.5%, have stayed. So we'll use that factor here to calculate the required balance in our compensation expense for the period. On our liability account for the period. Now, I mentioned a liability account. Why did I mention that? Well, don't forget, we're not paying these people in shares. We're paying these people in cash. So if we have obligations to pay cash at a later date, that's a liability by definition. So now, instead of crediting every year an amount to a contributed capital account, we're going to be crediting a long-term compensation liability account. How are we going to calculate that? Well, again, using the same method that we did in the equity settled plan, we're going to take our fair value multiplied by the cumulative vesting fraction and multiply that product by the estimated retention to see that we need to have $18,125 in the long-term compensation liability and compensation expense account. Well, we don't have anything to open the period, so those are the amounts we're going to debit and credit these two accounts for in 2011. Now, in 2012, we can see using the same math, we need $15,000 in the account. But we've got more than enough. We've got $18,125. So in fact, we have too much in the long-term compensation liability account, so we are going to remove the difference, which is $3,125. So the way I set this up is I'm going to reduce the long-term compensation liability by $3,125 and credit what we call a compensation recovery amount. So it's a recovery of past amounts that were expensed that are now being recovered because the amount that you require is less than the amount you already have in the account. The other account you could credit here, if you didn't want to use a compensation recovery account, is you could credit a compensation expense account directly if you wanted to. I find many students are uncomfortable with crediting expense accounts. They're usually used to crediting gains, or in this case, a recovery account. So that's why I use a recovery account. Now, at the end of 2013, when we do the math based on a fair value of $90,000, we're going to find that we need to have $74,250 in our long-term compensation liability account. So therefore, because we've only had $15,000 as at the end of 2012, we're going to have to shore that up by $59,250. So at the end of 2013, we'll make a journal entry to debit the compensation expense and credit the long-term compensation liability by $59,250. And that will be the amount of our that will actually have in the account, or after we post this journal entry, that will put $74,250 in the account. Now you'll notice that's not the same as $90,000, but we don't need it to be. Why? Because we're only going to pay out cash, a cash obligation, based on the number of employees that are actually here with us, right? So we're only going to calculate or pay out cash based on the number of employees who stayed. So that's why knowing this factor is very important, because this is an actual factor based on the number of employees who actually remained, which is 33 of the 40 employees. So those are our journal entries to recognize the compensation expense under a cash-settled share-based compensation plan.